8 years ago, we all had to get used to a new pope. And for some, that might have been hard because we had such good memories of John Paul II. But today, we have some new good memories. Memories of the papacy of Benedict XVI. A papacy that will be remembered for this pope's great teachings and for this announcement.
Qua propter bene consus pontes huius actus plena libertate declaro, me ministerio episcopi Rome, successore Sancti Petri, vi permanens cardinalium, die 11 aprilis bis 15 commissum, renunciare ita da die 28 februari bis 13 hora 20, sedes Rome, sede Sancti Petri vacet, et conclave ad elicendum novum sum pontificem, ab his quibus competit convocandum esse.
That was Pope Benedict XVI on February 11th, 2013, when he announced to the world that he would be retiring as Pope. And so we come to the end of another papacy, a time to remember and to look back. And to help us do exactly that, we've brought in two guests, Bishop William McGrattan. He's an auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of Toronto, and Oriana Bertucci. She's the director of campus ministry for Ryerson University, also in Toronto. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
So let's go back 8 years, if that's not too far to go back. Do you remember when Benedict was elected? What was that moment like for you?
Well, it was twofold for me. It was first the death of John Paul II, and I was at St. Peter's Seminary, and I remember gathering the seminarians and having an impromptu prayer service.
After the death of
After the death. And then it was almost spontaneous again after the announcement of Pope Benedict as his successor. There was this sort of desire to gather in the chapel and to pray for the successor of Peter. So it was sort of combined, the death of John Paul II and then also the election of Pope Benedict.
I guess having been, it's interesting because you were the rector of the seminary.
That's right, yes.
And I don't know, well, we'll get to you in a second, but that seminary community, what would have been the time between I guess the mourning period and the conclave period, what sort of conversations are happening in the hallway or in the classroom?
Well, I think as most seminarians, they were quite interested, you know, in the future of the church, and they all had, of course, their desire for a certain pope. He was probably, in their minds, the one that they had become more familiar with.
So people were talking about
Yes.
Joseph Ratzinger.
Yeah, they were.
So it wasn't a surprise.
Not really, no.
Yeah. And Oriana, where were you 8 years ago?
I'm not sure I even knew what a conclave was 8 years ago.
Oh, really?
I had just started a new part-time job, and everyone in my office, I remember coming into work not really knowing what the makeup of the people in my office were. And the IT guy had wheeled this television into the mailroom, and they had live feed. It was on the news. And they said, you know, everybody come look, you know, we'd seen black smoke. And
so, but this was not a Catholic organization?
No, it was not at all. But
really?
It was interesting because Catholics and non-Catholics were all interested in what was happening.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the first vote, we have black smoke, learning what that meant. And then all of a sudden, the receptionist, who at the time was this little 75-year-old, very devout Catholic woman, calls up to my office and just yells, "White smoke!" And everybody comes running downstairs.
Right.
And there we sat for an hour waiting for them to announce who it was. And so I think it was really the introduction for me to see what a conclave was. I grew up with John Paul, so this was the first time I'd ever experienced anything.
If you were not familiar with even the concept of conclave, did you even know who Cardinal Ratzinger was?
No idea.
So that was not even...
The media introduced me to him that day.
Right, and what did you hear? What was your first thoughts about who this man was?
Oh, he's German. I mean, that was it, you know. I mean, I think I learned after to perhaps not take everything that the media said, to do my own research and to learn a little bit more. But you know, what they shared with me that night on the evening news was what I knew of Cardinal Ratzinger at the time.
Right. Now, Bishop, you were not a bishop.
No.
8 years ago. You were ordained a bishop during this papacy.
That's correct.
So does that mean that you will remember this papacy in a special way?
Yes. I do remember, receiving the call from the nuncio, having a very prolonged discussion, and then I remember him asking the question, the Holy Father, Pope Benedict, is waiting for your answer. And even though he was the messenger, sort of asking me, it was a sense that it was the Holy Father asking me for the decision that the Church was asking me to be a bishop. Was I free to accept that?
How soon after? When were you ordained?
I was ordained on January 12th, 2010, and then the next September I was over to what they call bishop school.
Yes.
It's when all of the bishops who were named in that previous year are invited to Rome for 3 weeks of talks, of conferences. But then we all had that chance to have a personal audience and to thank him personally, even though I had written a letter acknowledging personally as well before my ordination, asking for his prayers. But to have that personal encounter in that September.
So wait, so that was the first time you ever met him in person?
No. No, I had been to Rome for a international meeting of rectors in the late 90s.
Okay.
And he addressed us. And
as Cardinal, right?
As Cardinal.
Yes.
And I was very impressed with the pastoral sense, his understanding of seminary formation. And I remember him talking about the fact that there's discernment of a vocation is a very important responsibility in the Church. And he said, you as rectors have that responsibility to help candidates through their personal discernment, but also to undertake the discernment of the Church with respect to this vocation.
Had he been a professor at a seminary?
I think he had been, and he was open to questions. He gave his input, and then he asked for reactions. And I really felt that there was, the Italians say simpatico. There was a sense that he was one with us.
So now fast forward to 2010 when you went as a bishop. That personal meeting, was it a private meeting or all the bishops together?
It was all the bishops, and we had probably about maybe 30 seconds to a minute to exchange greetings. And then after that visit, I sort of made a commitment to myself. Every time I was in Rome, I was going to make the effort to go to a Wednesday audience and have the opportunity, to give that personal greeting.
That's right, because bishops can go afterwards.
Yeah, and I found it very significant. I've been there twice since being a bishop, and having that opportunity to, again, personally address him, say that I'm praying for him, and then vice versa, to hear him say the same thing.
Yeah, I think I want to ask you a little later what that sort of your impressions of him, personal impressions. But so Oriana, I'm kind of still a little unsure as to where you were in your faith 8 years ago. But so you're a woman. You're a young woman, so what are your impressions of this papacy as someone who's involved with university students and with youth, young adults, and as a young adult yourself?
Well, as I mentioned, I think many of my generation grew up with John Paul. He was, in a sense, kind of like our father. And Benedict came on the scene almost in a way as a grandfather. He was much older. And I think as I, in my early 20s especially, was really developing my spiritual maturity and understanding what it meant to be a witness of my faith in the public sphere, taking that on as my own. I think one of the things that Benedict was was a wonderful example of different ways to be a witness. So we could be very charismatic and very outgoing, but we could also be reserved and reflective. And all those were different gifts that individuals possess. And it's about knowing who we are and how we live that out to share with those around us. So
your faith growth during this papacy, would you say that it was
significant? For sure, definitely. And I think, you asked as a young person, as a woman in ministry, a couple of things come to mind. John Paul had started World Youth Days, and I had the opportunity to see him at 2 World Youth Days. Very significant, very impactful on my understanding of who the Pope was, what as a young Catholic, how you could reach out. And I think John Paul, we all know, is very charismatic. And so the question of World Youth Days at one point, will they continue? They did. And Benedict went to all 3 of them.
Away
clearly,
that
commitment. You spoke of him in a little bit as a teacher. And I think so many times during the past 8 years, we've seen moments of him being a teacher come alive.
That's who he is.
I think of the UCAT. I love the UCAT.
Yes.
It's yellow, it's bright, there's pictures, it's fun. You know, open it and there's the little man doing the little jumps.
Yes. Yeah.
But you know, that was part of his commitment.
That's
his
true.
commitment to youth. And on the back it says, you know, I challenge you to learn this, to live this, and to share it on the internet.
Yeah.
You know, so I think clearly that commitment. And finally, I think as a woman in ministry, one of the things that I was really struck by was this past October at the Synod on the New Evangelization, we saw an invitation to more lay people and to more women than in any other synod previously. And I think that speaks to Vatican II's call to the laity to be a well-formed, engaged, involved lay person in how you give and how you can be effective in the church. So I was particularly happy to see that. Yeah,
so maybe not that traditional and conservative, and then maybe a little bit of a reformer in a sense, this new Pope 8 years ago. We're going to take a little break, so don't go anywhere because it's short, but when we come back, we're going to continue this conversation, and in particular, we're going to look at some of the highlights of this papacy of Benedict XVI, so don't go anywhere.
Let us know your perspective. Email us at perspectives@saltandlighttv.org or reach us by mail, Perspectives at Salt and Light Television, 114 Richmond Street East, Toronto, Ontario, M5C 1P1, or call us toll-free at 1-888-302-7181. Let your perspective be heard.
It seems incredible, but in the last 8 years, a lot happened. I mean, just the travels. Pope Benedict went on 24 trips outside of Italy. I find that incredible because this doesn't seem that much. I mean, we remember the big ones, England and the Middle East. He was in Brazil, and he was supposed to go back to Brazil, Australia, all the World Youth Days. 4 encyclicals, 5 synods. What maybe stands out in your memory, or what will stand out?
Well, I think he's challenged not only the church, but the world in terms of entering into authentic dialogue. And what I would say there is that he sees the gift of faith, he sees the long tradition of our theological reflection on that faith, and he wants to make sure that that witness is meeting the challenges and the needs of our current culture, our society.
Sorry, and you see that how?
Well, in the sense of the Synod on the Word, on the Eucharist, on the new evangelization. So there's this sense of renewal, those topics of renewal of the Church, of going back to and reflecting, and then gathering the bishops from around the world to sort of bring that pastoral dimension, that reflection on those eternal truths and elements of our faith.
Yeah.
His encyclicals, you know, I think I've heard many say that, you know, they are so readable by many people.
Yeah, John Paul's were a little harder to read, I find.
They were.
It's true.
And I would say that I've come to appreciate where you're reading one of his encyclicals, whether it be Deus Caritas Est or Spe Salvi. There's all of a sudden you come across either a paragraph or a sentence, and it sort of strikes you because it's so simplistic in its truth and presentation of the faith that it sits with you.
Yeah.
I totally agree, and I think also the topics. You know, when I think encyclical, I thought, well, he could talk about church doctrine or canon law. What does he talk about? God is love.
Yeah.
How beautiful is that? We all have that desire to enter into that relationship with Christ, and he's making it very relatable.
You know, a lot of people thought that that was a big surprise, that you expected the first encyclical was going to be about some moral issue, and it was about love.
You know, the term I think has been used, it's sometimes poetic, his choice of phrases. And when you sort of reflect on that insight, I would say it's almost poetic. It sort of sits with you, and the Holy Spirit sort of brings back many of his words and his teachings. And
you mentioned World Youth Day earlier. Did you have a chance to? Yeah, you were in Madrid with us.
Yes, I was.
Remember that?
Yeah. I had every desire to be there for the closing mass, but was prevented.
Oh,
yes.
that's right. Yes, there were issues.
But thanks to technology and Salt and Light and Father Rosica, I received the Pope's homily, and I was able, in the context of celebrating Mass for our pilgrims, to actually read his homily, which I thought it was important to connect the young people who, you know, disappointment, they couldn't be there, but we celebrated the mystery of the Eucharist together, and they heard the words of the Holy Father from my iPhone.
From your iPhone.
Yeah.
There you go, technology.
That's right.
I don't want to compare, because it's not about, you know, this Pope at World Youth Day or that Pope at World Youth Day, but did you find, I don't know, did you have a chance to go to any World Youth Days with John Paul?
Yes, both with John Paul.
Oh, so you did not have a chance to go to any. Did you have a chance to go to?
I was here in
Toronto,
and then the next one was Madrid. Yeah.
Would you say that? I mean, World Youth Day is World Youth Day. It doesn't really matter who the Pope is. Would you say that that's true? That
I think there was
is there a difference with Benedict?
A faith expressed in the young people is that they saw in Pope Benedict the same as they saw in John Paul II. Someone who was simply trying in humility to lead the church and to be open to the next generation. And both popes, I think, have demonstrated that they want to ensure that the young people are connected or feel a sense that they can be understood and that they can have an opportunity to connect with the Holy Father.
I think by just coming to World Youth Day, you know, there was some uncertainty, will he come? Shows that young people are a priority. Even with, I remember the Eucharistic Congress, because there was some talk that when it was in Quebec in 2008 that he might come. And of course he wasn't able to come, but he was there because thanks to technology, he was there on the big screen and there was that connection. So maybe he wasn't able to physically be there, but he was very much there. Which I think shows the same. And I remember people, we were standing outside in the rain and it started, you know, it was coming down. There's always rain in these moments. People wanted to hear what he had to say. Yes, you know? Yes, absolutely. It was wonderful. See, I said that I'd go back to your personal thoughts of him, because not a lot of people got to know him or speak to him in person, but everybody said that he was, that there's a demeanor that he had.
There was a gentleness, there was a simplicity, there was a genuineness when he looked upon you with his eyes, that he was engaging, even though the conversation may have been brief. But I think what struck me in his resignation is that that humility, that sort of acceptance of God's will, that, you know, we all ask for that grace to sort of live. It's almost as if he was like John the Baptist. He must increase, I must decrease. Yes. And that's a huge teaching. And I think that when I look at his pontificate, I would say that he reminds me of that. That's a great image. Yeah, John the Baptist. Yeah, because I was thinking the same thing, that even with his resignation. Yeah. I don't even like to call that his announcement that he would retire, his retirement. He's saying something very specific, and it's not about him. No. I think he also understood his role as the servant of the servants of God, you know, and recognizing that he got to a point where it was about more than him, and he understood that. He knew when it was time. And we probably shouldn't be talking about it in past tense, because he still is, and he still understands that, and he's still a servant. Just in a different capacity. We need to conclude our conversation. We always like to conclude by leaving the last word to the Word.
And so here is a passage from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 17 to 20. And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Again, that's from Matthew chapter 16, verses 17 to 20. Oriana.
Someone recently gave me a copy of Archbishop Miller from Vancouver, a book that he wrote a number of years ago called The Shepherd and the Rock. And in it, he talks about how our foundation really is, it's not sand, it's not jelly, it is that rock. And that's where our church is built, and that's where we need to build the foundation of our lives. And I love Peter, the Greek for Petra, rock, that idea that he is the rock. And Jesus chose Peter despite the fact that he denied him, because Peter came back in humility, repented, asked for forgiveness, knew that he needed Christ. And I think in so many ways we see that humility in Peter to come back, and we see that in Benedict, always willing to say yes. Even probably at 78 when he was elected Pope, he wanted to retire, but he submitted to God's will, and he said, yes, I will do that. And recognizing in his resignation, the church is going to be there on that foundation. We need that rock. We don't want to create the sand and the jelly. We need to always ensure that that rock is preserved.
Thank you. Bishop.
I think more on a personal note, I think when our Holy Father would have read those passages, that passage, I hope it would have spoken to him in his own personal prayer throughout the 8 years of his pontificate. There are many passages in Scripture that we can identify with, but I think as a pope and as the successor of Peter, the passage you read, I think, would speak to him. And I hope he gained a lot of consolation, a lot of strength in making the decision. And I really see, his deep spirituality and his prayer life as a rock. I mean, you don't make this decision to step down very lightly. And, I only hope and I pray that it was, and I know it was out of a deep relationship with our Lord and a conviction of prayer. And I mean, that to me is the rock of the church. That's the rock of faith. It's the rock of that personal encounter with Christ. And he lives it in a specific way as the servant of the servants. But he has to live it based on a deep prayer life and a spirituality and an encounter with the Lord. I just hope he gains consolation when he reads that passage of Scripture.
I think you're right. I do, and I think a lot of us do. Anyway, thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your perspectives with us. We've been speaking with Bishop William McGrattan. He's Auxiliary Bishop of the Archdiocese of Toronto, and Oriana Bertucci. She's the Director of Campus Ministry for Ryerson University. Again, thank you so much. We heard from them. We'd love to hear from you. You can always send us your perspectives to perspectives@saltandlighttv.org, and also you can always contact us through Facebook. So that's all for tonight. May God continue to bless you and your home.